I love The Last of Us. Ever since I decided to pick up the franchise for the first time back when quarantine began, I instantly fell in love with the franchise. The dynamic between Joel and Ellie was unlike anything I'd seen before. Sure, there've been games trying to replicate the dynamic, but nothing ever came close to it for me. The story was simplistic but incredibly well done. As you can tell, I loved the game and its controversial sequel. So when I heard they were making a one-to-one adaptation of the game in the live-action show, I was incredibly excited. Most video game adaptations I've seen have failed horribly, but if there was one adaptation that I think would suit a live-action show, it would be The Last of Us. The story is simplistic enough to recreate in a live-action format, and the set pieces would be plausible but expensive to recreate. So I waited for further updates on the show, and then the trailer released. And I didn't like in the slightest. The show looked like a cheap fan film. Bella Ramsey put me off with her Ellie performance, especially with that weird clicker impersonation she did. Pedro Pascal's acting was shockingly dull, and I left the trailer with a bad taste in my mouth. The more news that came out about the show, the less excited I was. I was still going to watch the show nonetheless, but I approached it with a very cautious mindset, expecting it to be like every other live-action video game adaptation. So I went ahead and watched it the day it came out. And is it the 10 out of 10 masterpiece that everyone says? Well, no, but I still really liked what this episode brought to the table. It just has a few annoying problems that I would like to talk about. I think that the main problem I have with the first episode is how much extra time they give Sarah. And yes, extra time spent on a character is good, but it's only good if you develop said character with the extra time you've given her, and not to just meander around. Instead of extra character development, they only use her as a narrative device to show us the world slowly going to hell throughout the course of the day. In a world-building sense, it's fine. It gives us a bit more insight into how society is reacting to the outbreak, instead of only experiencing it through Joel and Sarah's eyes. But other than the extra world building, the whole extra 30 minutes of screen time that was spent on Sarah felt pretty redundant. I don't really need a whole 10 minutes dedicated to how Joel's watch was fixed, when it was already implied in the game on how it was fixed. I also don't need to see where Joel went to while Sarah was sleeping. Again, this can all be guessed from the audience point of view, and only pads out the episode more. If you're wanting to give Sarah more screen time, I was hoping you would at least make her less of a one-dimensional character, but no. You could skip the first 20 minutes regarding the Sarah scenes, and her death would pretty much have the same effect as the death in the game. I also think that Nico Parker, the actress who plays Sarah, does a pretty mixed job at playing the character. The stuff that she's given pre-outbreak-wise is fine, but once Joel and Tommy come to save her from the infected grandma is where her performance starts to become a little bit shaky. Especially during her death scene. I know it's pretty hard to follow up on Hannah Hayes' performance, but it just felt pretty unbelievable at points. Her performance isn't the biggest flaw in the show, it's just a small thing, but it still matters to me. Unfortunately, there were also a couple contrivances in the first episode. Most of them weren't significant enough for them to disrupt the flow of the story for me. However, there was one or two contrivances that annoyed me quite a bit. That specific contrivance being the reason as to why Joel's car crashed. As Joel, Tommy, and Sarah are trying to escape the country with the car, some airplanes fly above them, showing a few people trying to escape the country. Later on, when they're in the car trapped in the city, a plane dives directly behind the car and explodes. A piece of the wreckage then proceeds to fly through the window of the car, shattering it, and doesn't manage to kill anyone. Even though if a piece of wreckage at that size was flying at you and hit you, you'd be dead. But even ignoring that, the plane conveniently crashed right next to where Tommy, Joel, and Sarah were, which is the sole reason for how Sarah dies, because without that injured foot, the military wouldn't have killed her. Also, why did the plane take off so late from the other planes? 3 of them took off at the same time, and this one fucked around for maybe 5 minutes. I guess you could excuse it for the pilot taking a while to start it up, or maybe he tried to find a plane because the rest were taken. Either way, it's contrived nonetheless that the car was affected by this. But it doesn't end there. Once Joel and Sarah escape from the wreckage, Joel turns into a wrong corner that is filled to the brim with infected. Joel runs away from it and he gets saved out of nowhere by a military agent. While that's pretty convenient timing that saved Joel's life, and if that military agent wasn't there to shoot that runner, the show would be extremely different right now. But then later on in the scene when the military agent is about to kill Joel, Tommy now appears at the last second to kill the military agent. What's happening right now? There was also another contrivance earlier on in the episode that didn't personally annoy me, it was just really funny. So early in the episode we get introduced to this old couple, and the grandma is practically on her last breath. She's pretty much a vegetable, you know, she's getting there. So later on when Sarah wakes up, she goes to the neighbor's house and finds the grandma having a tasty snack. Context, by the way, the reason why she goes to the neighbor's house is because their dog showed up next to Sarah's house, so she tried to return it but the dog ran away. The grandma then stops what she's doing and chases after Sarah. Sarah exits out of the house and the grandma just doesn't follow her outside the house for a bit, so Joel and Tommy can conveniently show up at the perfect time to save Sarah. If that grandma had actually chased Sarah out of the house, she would be dead right now. But apparently dementia can also affect you in death, so she stands around in the house for a bit before remembering that she has to chase after the girl, only when Tommy and Joel save Sarah in the nick of time. Then, at the end of the episode, we come to our final contrivance, that being the military officer confrontation. Joel, Ellie, and Tess are navigating through this wasteland trying to escape the quarantine zone, when all of a sudden they stumble across a military officer pissing. Not even joking, this is what happens. Out of all the places he could have pissed, it was conveniently the place where Joel, Ellie, and Tess would go to. But this isn't any military officer. This was the exact military officer that Joel was selling drugs to earlier on. Now what are the fucking chances of that? One last criticism I have for this episode is when Sarah dies. Now this is more of a personal preference, but it affected me enough for me to mention it. In the first game when Sarah dies, it cuts the intro sequence and helps bridge the gap between the past and present. It helps the scene not feel jarring when transitioning and instead feels natural to help the audience process what happened. In the show, they immediately transition from Sarah's death to the present day. It feels jarring here because instead of giving the audience time to process, it immediately jumps to the next big thing in the story, thus making it feel jarring to the audience. Apart from a couple of odd pacing decisions, like the ones I talked about earlier, the pacing in the show is pretty good. It feels very similar to the first game in the sense that it takes its time, and doesn't rush too much into things. It's something I really appreciate about this show, because usually, video game adaptations try to rush to make as many references as they possibly can in a single episode. However, in this case, The Last of Us takes its time, and not only makes the occasional reference when it's necessary to the plot, aside from its major plot issues, HBO's The Last of Us is incredibly well made. The cinematography in the show is incredible and gives you this feeling that you are right there with Joel when the action is happening. Part of that feeling is due to the show being made to look like you're looking at it from a third-person point of view. The other parts feel incredibly amateurish, and that's not a bad thing in the slightest. I think the amateurish cinematography is done purposefully so it makes you not only think of the camera as an object in the show, but a character as well. When the scenes are exposition heavy or non-action oriented, the cinematography becomes quite creative, ranging from high-angle shots, close-up shots, long shots. Sometimes it even pulls an extreme wide shot just to show the scale of how big a challenge something is going to be. For example, at the end of the episode, the camera pans up to show the twin buildings from the original game. It is meant to look foreboding, and to the people who haven't already played the game know how challenging it will be. However, the people who haven't played the game can still tell how much of a challenge the building will be, due to the building being the main subject of the shot. And to reinforce that the buildings are in the main subject, they add some lightning to highlight the building. Another thing that they also highlight in this scene was the clicker on the building, not only giving some intrigue to newer audiences, but excitement to people who have played the game. Another great piece of cinematography is whenever they use a tracking shot, or the camera starts to pan around the scene. These shots in the show are only particularly used to show an important detail, to build tension, or to show the intensity of a scene. My favorite moments of when they use this kind of cinematography is when Joel, Tommy, and Sarah are trying to leave town in their car. In this scene, multiple camera pans and tracking shots are used to reinforce the intensity and stress of the scene, and it almost feels like we're looking at the moment through Sarah's eyes, or at times feeling like a third-person perspective for Sarah. It's probably my favorite piece of cinematography in this episode, due to how much effort was put into the scene, making it feel as intense as they possibly could. Overall, the show's cinematography is extremely well done. However, I don't want to hype up the cinematography into you thinking it's some kind of Mr. Robot Better Call Saul cinematography. It's good cinematography, but it's not perfect, it's not masterful. It's just damn good cinematography, and that's all I can say about it. This may not be surprising to most of you, since one of the people behind this show was also responsible for the Chernobyl miniseries. I'm quite happy with the cinematography in the show, and I can say the same for the music. I love how they used Gustavo's incredible soundtrack from the first game. However, my only problem with this approach is that Gustavo hasn't made any real new music for the show, so they're just kind of reusing soundtracks. And it's kind of disappointing, since I would have loved to see Gustavo make new tracks for the show, but they're all just kind of the same as the first game, if not a bit remixed. Which is fine, it's not exactly a problem in my opinion, but I do wish that Gustavo got to make some newer tracks for the show. Again, not a problem, just more up to personal preference. Despite all that, I did really love hearing the tracks they did use for certain scenes. It gave me some nostalgia for when I originally heard the tracks being used in the game. Like when the home soundtrack came on, when ironically Joel arrived home. It's a cute subtle detail, and I love when the show includes little details like that in the show. Surprisingly, the one that wasn't from Gustavo, other than some usual generic intense music, was a licensed song, which was the one they play at the end. The song is titled Never Let Me Down Again. It's a pretty brilliant way to end the episode, since from what has been established earlier, an 80s song means trouble. There's some surprising symbolism behind the song that plays at the end. For example, the line, "I'm taking a ride with my best friend. I hope he never lets me down again." Both Joel and Ellie grow to love and care for each other by the end of the game, and they are going to let each other down multiple times, and the song itself is about drugs. So this is obviously going to be a terrible and scary journey for them to embark on. Promises me are the safest houses, as long as I remember who's wearing the trousers. This is another line that feels pertinent to me. Ellie wants to be treated like an adult, but can't be acting out if she wants to survive the trip with Joel, and make it to the Fireflies in one piece. Apparently this song will return at a later point in the season, but in a darker tone. So maybe on rewatch this song might be more impactful for me, and my score for this episode might be raised a little higher. Acting wise, it's mostly solid. Pedro Pascal fits the role of Joel pretty well, and definitely gives off daddy vibes from his performance. Everyone is mostly great except for Bella Ramsey as Ellie. So far she hasn't really sold me as Ellie yet. Maybe later on throughout the show I'll grow on her performance a little more, but so far I'm not impressed. I've seen a lot of people giving her shit for Bella looking nothing like Ellie, and I would like to say that's pretty unfair. It's a different interpretation of the game while having the same bone structure of the original. Of course, not everyone is going to look exactly like their characters, and not everything from the games will be in the show. So far, my thoughts on Bella are cautious optimism. She's not off to a great start, but I think she really has the ability to knock it out of the park as Ellie. The final thing I'd like to talk about when it comes to the pilot episode is the show's impressive attention to detail. I really like the transformation of the zombie grandma throughout the day, and seeing her twitch so weirdly in the background was a terrifying detail they put in. When we got introduced to the first infected, it felt kind of like a homage to the first Resident Evil. The way the runner slowly looks up at Sarah, releasing the jaw from the corpse as she stares at Sarah, it felt like an Easter egg to Resident Evil, and it made me giddy when I made the connection. I really like how early you can see the father-daughter relationship appear in Joel and Ellie. For example, when Ellie asks Joel questions about the outside, you can see the fear in her eyes and how afraid she is when asking these questions. And Joel answers these questions in a very fatherly way. He isn't cold with her, he's direct, but in a comforting way, like a father would be.
I've never been on the other side of the wall. Look how dark it is. You guys go out there a lot?
I guess.
When was the last time?
maybe a year. What's it matter?
But you know where to go, so we're gonna be okay.
Yeah.
Earlier on, I mentioned how enraged Joel became with the federal officer. I feel like I haven't touched upon this scene enough, and despite the massive contrivance in said scene, it still has something I loved about it, that being Pedro Pascal's performance. You can see Joel's heart break in the scene when he's trying to defend Ellie from getting shot. We see a flashback of how Joel is feeling, and in most media, this kind of narrative device would usually be used as a crux in the story. However, in this show, it feels like the flashbacks are moving the plot forward and are developing Joel's character more. When Joel was beating up that Fedra guard, you could see the rage come out of him. The rage that had been manifesting since Sarah's death had all been let out at that very moment. And as you see Ellie watching him, she isn't afraid or scared, she's more intrigued. Most people would be frightened of Joel in that moment, but Ellie looks at him in surprise and interest. Even Sarah, Joel's daughter, couldn't handle seeing Joel murder someone, even though she knew that that neighbor was trying to kill her. She still felt awful about seeing her die like that. But with Ellie, she has no reaction, only morbid curiosity. When Joel stops beating on the Fedra guard, he looks back at Ellie with a look on his face that can only be described as shit, it happened again. It shows you how hard it is for Joel to keep himself under control. Early on in the episode, Tess is showing trying to calm Joel down when telling Joel about Robert. It's almost like she's trying to talk to a child. Personally, I found this to be a great piece of characterization that showed the contrast between Joel before the outbreak and Joel post-outbreak. I enjoyed the introduction of the show, where it started off in the 60s when the scientists talked about the fungi, and the conversation slowly turning more dark by the minute. It set the tone very effectively, and is one of the best cold opens to a pilot I've ever seen. It especially made the scenes with the Miller family more intense. What seems to be a normal birthday breakfast for the family is full of happiness and joy, but for the audience it couldn't be any more different. It feels intense, you're waiting for the outbreak to happen, and because of the cold open, it's made the Miller family scenes more tense and unpredictable due to not knowing when the first infected might show up. The cold open helps new people become contextualized and prepared for what to come next, and for the older audience, it's a message to get ready for what's to come. The 60s segment then cuts to black and plays the intro segment to the show. And honestly, the intro to this show is incredible. The way they shot and made the intro was really creative. It reminded me of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon's intro, where the camera pans around parts of the map. It wouldn't surprise me if there was some inspiration taken from Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon, since both shows are on HBO and share a platform with The Last of Us. I also appreciate how many small details there are on the intro. Near the beginning we see the fungus growing into a city, then the fungus spread into the shape of America, which is then followed by the fungus making a nose for the runner that is made up of what seems to be moss and miscellaneous pieces of nature. And finally, at the end, we see the outline of Joel and Ellie being created by the fungus, which is by far the best part of the intro, showing the only reason that Joel and Ellie are even together, the only reason as to why they've bonded this close is because of the fungal outbreak. Which is depressing because of all the loss they've been through in order for the relationship to happen this way, but hopeful because of the bond they've created with each other. It shows them with a bit more humanity than the pair previously had. Honestly, I couldn't have imagined a better intro for the show. I also like the importance and emphasis on some scenes. Some parts of the show will show you a scene, object, or character, and bring it back together full circle. Sometimes there are references in the show that you don't even notice until you rewatch the episode again. Despite my problems with the episode's writing, I appreciate how much thought they put into the details of the story, and how often they include said details back into the story later on. Again, the writing isn't perfect, but it's the little things like this that make me appreciate this show even more. Now it's time we discuss the massive elephant in the room, that being the changes. When I heard about some of the changes that were being made, I was not happy at all, to say the least. And now that the show's out, do I still think they're a bad thing? Well, for the most part, no. I think the spores being changed to tendrils is fine. It makes that show have that added sense of realism that The Last of Us loves to have. One thing that they changed about the show that I cannot forgive, though, is that the fact that it is set in 2003. Now, to anyone who hasn't played the games or hasn't played Part 2 yet, the year the apocalypse being set in was a big deal. Since the show is set in 2003, we won't get the Future Days song by Pearl Jam, the song that was a huge plot point for Part 2, not only used as foreshadowing for Ellie and Joel, but also being something that starts to define Ellie's character later on in the game. As someone who's a fan of Parts 1 and 2, it pisses me off. I guess they'll replace the song with a similar one, but it's just something that annoys me particularly. Overall, I really enjoyed the first episode of HBO's The Last of Us. It's not without its problems, but I'm excited to see where the show goes next. I will do another video on the show when it's done, which is where I'll be reviewing the show in its entirety and my complete thoughts on it. Also, if you think I'm hating on the show because I criticized it for a majority of the video, I don't. I love The Last of Us, and I want this show to be amazing, so think of it as me giving this show some tough love, because I do want this show to be perfect. As of now, I'm going to give episode 1 a 7.5 out of 10. But that could easily change once the show is over, and the episode has foreshadowed some things to me that I didn't catch originally, so we'll see how this score holds up in the near future. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed, then be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and if you've already done that, then thank you so much. Join me on Discord to interact with others from the community, follow me on Letterboxd and Serialized for bite-sized reviews, or reviews I wouldn't make videos about. Finally, follow me on Twitter for video updates and general opinions on everything. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time, hopefully when my Stranger Things Season 4 video's up. Bye.